The wind swept across the high plains with a sound like the whisper of eternity, bending tall grasses that once hid the most powerful creatures of North America. In the days before the iron horse of the railroad and the smoking chimneys of the cities, the prairie itself seemed to breathe with life, for upon it moved an empire of flesh and horn, the buffalo. From horizon to horizon they stretched, their dark hides rolling like storm clouds, their hooves shaking the earth as if it were thunder made flesh. Early explorers, men hardened by wilderness travel, would stand dumbstruck before this sight, unsure whether they were gazing at animals or some divine flood sent across the grasslands. To the Plains tribes, there was no confusion. The buffalo was more than meat and bone. It was the heartbeat of creation. Among the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, and so many others, every part of the beast held purpose. The hide became shelter, clothing, and shield. The sinew turned to bowstring, strong as any steel wire. Bones became knives, awls, and tools. Even the hooves, boiled down, gave glue for weapons and ornaments. Nothing was wasted. To waste was to dishonor the spirit of the animal, a sacred gift from the Great Spirit. Ceremonies were woven around the buffalo's life and death. Prayers rose with each hunt, songs carried on the prairie winds to thank the creature for giving its body to the people. Imagine then the immensity of their world. Historians estimate that in the early 19th century, some 30 million bison roamed the Great Plains. Their range stretched from the forests of Pennsylvania to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, from the frozen reaches of Canada down into the blazing heat of Texas. To stand at the crest of a hill and see them was to glimpse the very soul of the continent. Captain Zebulon Pike, who explored the Southwest in 1806, described herds so vast that they darkened the horizon like a living ocean. One trapper spoke of a herd that took 3 full days to pass his camp, moving in a continuous wave, each beast following the next as though pulled by a single invisible current. For native nations, these herds were not just sustenance, they were freedom itself. Buffalo hunts were community events, a test of horsemanship, courage, and skill with bow or lance. On the open prairie, a young warrior proved himself by riding into the herd at full gallop, his horse weaving between thundering bodies, arrows loosed with deadly precision into the great beast's lungs. The women waited at the edges with knives to begin the work of butchering, skinning, and carrying away the bounty. At the end of the day, a successful hunt meant food through the winter, hides for new lodges, and songs of victory around the fire. Yet even as native people sang their thanks, outsiders were beginning to take notice with different eyes. To the settlers pushing west, to the traders in St. Louis, and to the tanners in the crowded cities, the buffalo was not a sacred being, but a commodity. Its hide could be turned into leather belts for the roaring factories of the Industrial Revolution. Its tongue, considered a delicacy, could fetch a fine price at markets. And to hunters with sharp eyes and steady hands, those endless herds were not a vision of awe, but of opportunity. Still, in these early days, the balance held. The buffalo had endured centuries of hunting by native tribes, wolf packs, and harsh winters. Its numbers seemed inexhaustible. Some observers believed the herds were as permanent as the Mississippi River, an eternal resource that could never run dry. The truth, however, was that the buffalo carried within its abundance the seeds of its downfall. Unlike the deer of the forests, the buffalo traveled in massive herds, concentrated and vulnerable. Once the tools of industry and commerce were turned against them, the very immensity that had awed explorers would become their undoing. But for now, in the first half of the 19th century, the Great Plains still roared with life. To ride across that sea of grass was to enter a world unlike any other, a place where the earth trembled under hooves and the air shimmered with dust kicked up by countless bodies. Travelers told stories of nights when herds would surround their camps, the breath of thousands rising like mist, the low grunts and bellows echoing through the dark. Some spoke of stampedes that flattened everything in their path, man, horse, wagon, like a force of nature unstoppable as flood or fire. It was a world both magnificent and fragile. The buffalo was not just the flesh and blood engine of the Plains tribe's survival. It was a symbol of the wild frontier itself, untamed, resilient, and eternal. And yet, in the distance, the rumble of change could already be heard. Railroads were creeping west, Merchants were hungering for more hides, and men with rifles sharper than any arrow were watching the herds with calculating eyes. The buffalo had ruled the heart of the continent for millennia, but every empire has its last days. The thunder on the horizon was not only the sound of hooves, it was the echo of history, galloping toward an ending no one yet dared to imagine. The steel rails of the railroad cut across the prairie like scars, their iron lines drawing the east into the untamed west. With each mile of track laid, the wilderness shrank, and the great herds that had once seemed eternal now found themselves hemmed in by progress. The trains did not just carry settlers and soldiers, they carried markets, hunger, and a new breed of men, the buffalo hunters. These hunters were not farmers looking to tame the land, nor explorers seeking discovery. They were opportunists, drifters, and veterans of war who now pointed their rifles at a different foe. To them, the buffalo was not a symbol of spirit or freedom, but of hard currency. A single hide could fetch $2 or $3. Good money for a man willing to endure loneliness, bitter cold, and the unrelenting danger of the plains. In an age when wages for a laborer might be $1 a day, the promise of fast wealth was irresistible. The weapon that made this killing possible was the Sharp's rifle, known on the frontier as the buffalo gun. Heavy and unforgiving, it fired a .50 caliber bullet that could travel nearly a mile with accuracy. In the right hands, it was devastating. A skilled hunter could drop a dozen buffalo before the herd even realized it was under attack. Unlike the arrow or the lance, which demanded courage and closeness, the Sharps allowed its user to kill from a cold distance. It was precision-made flesh, and in the 1870s it became the instrument of an industrial slaughter. Picture a hunting camp in those years. A canvas tent flaps in the relentless prairie wind. The smell of black powder and fresh blood mingles in the air. A hunter, clad in buckskin, darkened with sweat, sits beside his rifle, scanning the horizon. Around him lie the carcasses of the day's work, perhaps 20, perhaps 50. Skinners move quickly, stripping hides from the fallen beasts, stacking them in piles that will soon be loaded onto wagons bound for the nearest railhead. Wolves circle in the distance, their yellow eyes gleaming, waiting for their turn to feed on what is left behind. These men were as rough as the land they haunted. Some, like William "Buffalo Bill" Cody, achieved fame, their names etched into dime novels and vaudeville shows. Cody himself claimed to have killed more than 4,000 buffalo, often to provide meat for railroad workers. Others remained nameless, their stories buried beneath the hides they sold and the bones they left bleaching in the sun. They lived on black coffee, beans, and whiskey, and they carried with them the smell of sweat, powder, and rawhide. Their lives were brutal, lonely, and often short. A sudden blizzard could freeze a man in his sleep. A rattlesnake strike, a fall from a horse, or a wrong step near hostile territory could end it just as swiftly. Yet the danger was not always nature. The hunters knew that their actions struck at the very heart of the Plains tribes. For every hide taken, a family somewhere faced hunger. The native nations understood the hunters were not merely after profit. They were, intentionally or not, the cutting edge of conquest. Attacks on hunting camps were not uncommon. Hunters told stories of arrows slicing through tent walls in the dead of night, of warriors charging through herds to scatter them before the rifles could fire. Some hunters formed bands for protection. Others relied on military patrols that traveled the frontier with orders to secure the trade in hides. Dodge City, Abilene, and other rough-hewn towns became the supply hubs for this bloody commerce. In Dodge, the saloons roared with laughter and gunfire as hunters came in from the plains to drink away their wages. Card games stretched long into the night, fortunes made and lost over whiskey-soaked tables. Outside, wagons stood groaning beneath their loads of hides, waiting for the train east. The stench of raw, salted leather filled the air, and bones clattered beneath wagon wheels as the trade rolled on. Not every hunter was driven purely by greed. Some were enthralled by the sheer challenge of the work. Accounts survive of marksmen boasting of shots at 1,200 yards, of men competing to see who could bring down the largest bull in the fewest rounds. Others carried journals in which they marveled at the vastness of the herds, even as they thinned them. "They seemed endless," one Skinner wrote in 1872, "but we know better now. Each day's hunt leaves fewer shadows on the grass." Still, it was profit that kept most men pulling the trigger. The eastern markets clamored for hides to feed the factories of the Gilded Age. Conveyor belts, machine belts, and fine leather goods all demanded the buffalo's thick, durable skin. Railroad companies themselves often paid hunters to clear herds from the tracks, lest stampedes derail their trains. Industry and slaughter marched hand in hand. The buffalo hunters stood at the intersection of two worlds. Behind them lay the ancient rhythm of the plains, where the bison had ruled unchallenged for centuries. Ahead of them stretched the world of steel, money, and machines, where nothing was sacred except the dollar. They did not see themselves as destroyers of an empire, only as men trying to wrestle a living from a hard land. But history would remember them differently. For now, though, they sharpened their knives, cleaned their rifles, and scanned the horizon for the dark waves of another herd. Where the grass bent beneath the weight of millions, the hunters saw only targets. They were shadows cast across the plains, and the thunder of their rifles was the herald of an ending still unspoken. By the dawn of the 1870s, the prairie had become a killing ground. The herds that had once seemed boundless were suddenly within easy reach of rifles and railroads, and the scale of destruction defied imagination. From Texas northward to the Dakotas, hunters poured into the plains, their camps rising like temporary cities beside creeks and rivers. The air filled with the constant crack of rifles, the shouts of skinners and the lowing cries of wounded animals echoing across the grass. It was not a hunt, it was an industry. The railroad transformed everything. No longer did hides need to be dragged for weeks to distant settlements. With iron tracks now cutting across the heart of the plains, wagons loaded with salted hides rolled directly to depots. From there, trains carried the spoils to tanneries in the east, and from there to factories across the Atlantic. Europe's growing industries were just as hungry for leather as America's. A single freight car could carry thousands of hides, and in a single season, an army of hunters might send millions eastward. In Dodge City, Wichita, and Abilene, the profits spoke louder than conscience. Hide yards stretched like graveyards of the buffalo, piles stacked high and reeking under the sun. Merchants lined their pockets while saloon owners thrived on the whiskey poured for hunters returning from the field. Contemporary accounts describe rivers of liquor flowing, card games won and lost with the same speed as lives taken out on the plains. What had once been an ancient balance between man and beast was now commerce on an industrial scale. To achieve such efficiency required ruthless precision. Hunters spoke of their tactics. Approach downwind, lie flat on the grass, and begin firing at the edge of the herd. When one animal fell, the others rarely bolted at once. They milled in confusion, lowing and circling, giving the hunter his advantage. A practiced marksman could kill 20, even 30, in a single stand before the survivors finally thundered away in a panic. The work was methodical, detached, as though they were dismantling a machine rather than ending lives. Yet the waste was staggering. The hides and tongues were taken, the rest left to rot. Carcasses dotted the prairie by the thousands, the air heavy with stench. Travelers on the Kansas Pacific Railroad reported mile after mile of bloated bodies, blackened by sun and swarmed by scavengers. Wolves and coyotes feasted, while clouds of vultures darkened the sky. Some passengers wept at the sight. Others cheered, convinced they were witnessing the triumph of civilization over savagery. Military leaders knew exactly what this meant. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Department of the Missouri, spoke plainly to Congress. Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated, as it is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance. His words were not idle. The Army often stationed troops near hunting grounds, not to protect the buffalo, but to ensure hunters could continue their work without interference. For as long as the herds endured, the Plains tribes could resist, moving with freedom, sustained by abundance. Destroy the buffalo, and the people would have no choice but to yield to reservation life. For the native nations, it was an unfolding nightmare. Cheyenne and Lakota scouts reported herds thinning at astonishing speed. Once, a single day's ride would bring hunters to buffalo in every direction. Now warriors sometimes rode for days without sighting a single beast. One Lakota elder lamented, "When the buffalo go, the hearts of my people fall to the ground. We will be no more." Meanwhile, eastern markets celebrated the glut. Tanneries in Philadelphia and New York struggled to keep up with the influx of hides. Newspapers wrote of the bounty of the plains, often ignoring the desolation that bounty left behind. Leather belts powered the machines of the Industrial Revolution. Fine robes adorned parlors and salons. Few paused to consider the price paid in blood and silence. And then came the southern herd's collapse. By the mid-1870s, the vast buffalo population that had once roamed Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas had been hunted to near extinction. An estimated 5 million animals vanished in a matter of years. Hunters, following the last remnants northward, turned their sights on the Yellowstone country and the Dakota Territory. The northern herd faced the same fate. In Montana, hide men gathered near the Muscle Shell and Powder Rivers, their camps sprawling across the plains. The sound of rifles cracked day and night. Some hunters bragged of killing hundreds in a week, their wagons overflowing with hides. Freight teams hauled bones by the ton to be ground into fertilizer. Even the skulls were sold, packed into boxcars and shipped east for bone china and refining sugar. The buffalo was being consumed not only as meat and leather, but as raw material for the modern age. But the prairie bore the scars. Travelers who crossed the plains in the late 1870s spoke of silence where once the earth had thundered. The grasses grew unnaturally tall, unchecked by grazing. The wolves starved, their howls growing faint. It was as if a heartbeat had ceased, leaving the land in mourning. By 1880, the numbers told the truth. From 30 million, the herds had dwindled to less than 1,000 scattered survivors. The great slaughter was complete. What had once been an empire of the buffalo was now reduced to bones, hides, and memory. It was not merely the end of an animal's reign. It was the unraveling of a world, a transformation that would remake the West, breaking the old order and ushering in the new. And in that transformation lay tragedy, not only for the buffalo, but for the people who had depended upon them for generations. For the native nations of the Great Plains, the buffalo was not simply an animal. It was the center of their universe, the thread that bound their economy, spirituality, and way of life. When the herds vanished, it was as if the sun itself had gone out. No event in their history struck so deep, so sudden, and so mercilessly as the slaughter of the buffalo. The Comanche called themselves Numenu, the people, but they might just as easily have been called the people of the buffalo. For them and for the Lakota, Cheyenne, Kiowa, and countless others, every meal, every robe, every weapon spoke of the great herds. The buffalo was food, yes, but also tipi covers, shields hardened from its hide, sinew strings that sang in the bow, bone tools that cut and carved. Its skulls were set upon altars, honored in ceremonies that spoke of balance between man and nature. The hunt itself was sacred, a communion between hunter and hunted. Now that bond was broken. When hunters stripped the hides and left the carcasses to rot, they desecrated more than bodies. They desecrated an entire belief system. To walk among the fields of bones was, for a native hunter, like standing in a desecrated cathedral, its altars smashed and its people cast out. A Cheyenne elder once said, "When we killed the buffalo, we prayed. When they kill the buffalo, they curse." The words captured the deep rift between two worlds, one of reverence, one of exploitation. The loss came not gradually but like a blow. Within a single decade, tribes that had followed herds across the plains for centuries suddenly found emptiness where once there was plenty. Starvation stalked their camps. Elders who had once told stories of abundance now faced children with hollow cheeks and silent bellies. Women once skilled at tanning hides into warm robes now had no hides to work. Warriors, once proud horsemen who chased the hunt with courage, now found their skills useless against poverty. The spiritual wound cut just as deep. For the Lakota, the buffalo was a gift from Wakan Tanka, the Great Spirit. To see it destroyed was to feel that the Creator himself had turned away. Ceremonies grew heavy with grief. Songs of the hunt became laments for what was lost. The vision quests of young men, once guided by dreams of buffalo, now brought only silence or omens of despair. And with hunger and grief came dependency. The U.S. government, watching the buffalo herds collapse, pressed the tribes onto reservations with promises of rations and protection. But those rations were often late, spoiled, or inadequate. The native peoples who had once lived with abundance found themselves reduced to waiting in line for sacks of flour and salt pork, their freedom replaced with dependency, their dignity with humiliation. Military officers did not conceal their intentions. Some even boasted of it. Colonel Richard Dodge wrote, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." The policy was clear. By exterminating the buffalo, they would break the spirit of the tribes. And so it was. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse could inspire resistance, but even the bravest warrior could not feed his people when the herds were gone. The psychological toll was immense. For centuries, the buffalo had been at the center of stories, dances, and songs. Children learned to see the world through the hunt, to measure time by the seasons of the herds. With the herds destroyed, their stories became elegies, their dances reminders of what no longer existed. One Lakota woman remembered her grandmother telling her, "When I was a girl, we never feared hunger. Now we fear it every winter." At the same time, the land itself seemed to grieve. Where once herds had grazed, the grasses grew tall and wild, unbroken. Wolves that had thrived on the buffalo fell silent, their packs broken by hunger. The balance of the prairie, honed over thousands of years, was shattered in the span of a generation. The silence was not just absence, it was loss made visible. Yet amid the despair, there were moments of resilience. Some tribes adapted, turning to cattle or farming under duress. Others preserved their traditions and stories, carrying the memory of the buffalo forward even when its hooves no longer thundered on the plains. Resistance too endured. Raids on hunting camps, speeches before government agents, prayers offered for the return of the herds. Even as their world collapsed, they refused to let go entirely. But the truth was bitter. By the end of the 1870s, the buffalo that had been the center of native life for millennia was all but gone. The people were forced into a new existence, confined to reservations, bound by treaties rarely honored, stripped of the freedom that had defined them. The plains were in mourning, not only for the buffalo, but for the nations whose lifeblood had been taken with it. The destruction of the herds was more than an ecological disaster. It was an act of cultural annihilation. And though the bones could be gathered and the hides sold, the spirit of a people wounded by such loss could never be measured in dollars and cents. The thunder of hooves had become the silence of hunger, and in that silence the frontier shifted forever. By the early 1880s, the slaughter had run its course. The great herds were gone, scattered remnants hiding in ravines or clinging to remote valleys where hunters still sought them out. The thunder of hooves that once shook the earth had been silenced, replaced by the eerie stillness of the plains. What remained was a landscape of bones. Travelers told of horizons littered with white skeletons, rib cages rising like broken fences, skulls staring blindly into the sky. The sun bleached them until they gleamed in the prairie light, grim monuments to what had been lost. Men rode for days across these bone fields, the stench of decay lingering long after the flesh had rotted away. The land itself seemed haunted, as though ghosts wandered where herds had once roamed. Out of this desolation, a new industry emerged. Bones were gathered by the wagon load, piled into mountains beside railroads. From there they were shipped east, ground into fertilizer to feed the fields of Iowa and Ohio, or processed into bone china and fine industrial products. Photographs survive of men standing atop pyramids of buffalo skulls, grinning as though atop trophies rather than tombstones. For scavengers, the dead herds meant a final profit to be squeezed from what remained. As for the hunters, many found themselves adrift. The easy fortunes of the hide trade dried up almost overnight. Men who had once lived on whiskey and blood money wandered the towns of the frontier, broke and bitter. Some drifted into cattle ranching, trading one animal empire for another. Others found work as scouts or lawmen, carrying the same rifles that had emptied the prairies into new struggles. But many simply vanished, swallowed by the hard life of the West, their bones no less forgotten than the buffalo they had destroyed. A few left behind words of regret. One hunter, writing in a letter in 1882, admitted, "We thought there was no end. Now I ride and see only bones. It is a lonely country, and I sometimes think we have killed our own souls with those herds." But most never spoke of remorse. In the saloons of Dodge and Abilene, they boasted of their numbers, of record shots and vast kills, clinging to the only measure of success the trade had ever known, the count of bodies. The silence of the plains unsettled many who crossed them. Writers compared it to a cathedral abandoned, its music gone, its altars stripped bare. The wolves, once abundant, grew scarce. Coyotes scavenged but grew thin. The grasses swayed tall, but without the herds to graze them down, fires swept unchecked across the open country. The balance of centuries had been broken. The land seemed to mourn alongside the tribes who had lost their way of life. For settlers and ranchers, the absence of buffalo was both a curse and a blessing. On the one hand, the animal no longer trampled crops or blocked railways. On the other, the vast emptiness felt uncanny, a void where life had once moved like a tide. Ranchers moved cattle into the vacuum, reshaping the prairie into a new economy. But even they knew that something irreplaceable had been erased. In the imagination of the American public, the buffalo became a ghost almost as soon as it disappeared. Eastern newspapers that once celebrated the trade now lamented the destruction. Harper's Weekly published engravings of bleached bones, warning that the nation had committed an unthinkable crime against nature. Stories of the great herds became legends, told in tones of awe and disbelief, as if they were half myth. There once was a time, old men would say, when the earth itself shook with their passing. Younger listeners who had never seen such herds sometimes doubted the tales. But the bones did not lie. Boxcars rattling east with their grim cargo testified to the magnitude of the slaughter. Estimates suggest more than 30 million bison, reduced to less than 1,000 by the end of the 19th century. The numbers were so vast they defied comprehension. A whole species, once the symbol of abundance, had been brought to the brink of nothingness in the span of 2 generations. The hunters faded into memory. Their camps rotted away, their rifles pawned or rusting. Yet the prairies they left behind bore witness to their work. The silence, the bones, and the lingering smell of decay spoke louder than any man's tale. They had taken part in something larger than themselves, an ending as immense as the herds had once been. And in that ending lay a paradox of the frontier. The drive to conquer, to profit, to leave a mark on history had left behind not creation, but absence. It was an emptiness that whispered of both triumph and tragedy, of ambition unchecked and consequences unforeseen. The bones of the buffalo were not merely relics of a species, they were the monuments of an age, reminders of the cost at which the West had been won. By the late 1880s, the empire of the buffalo had been reduced to a handful of scattered survivors. The animal that had once commanded the Great Plains, that had sustained entire nations, now teetered at the brink of extinction. What had seemed eternal was revealed to be fragile. And yet, from the ashes of destruction, voices began to rise. Voices calling not for slaughter, but for salvation. Among those voices was William Temple Hornaday, chief taxidermist of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1886, Hornaday traveled west to collect specimens for the museum, only to discover that the herds had all but vanished. He expected to see thousands. Instead, he found only a few ragged groups clinging to survival in remote corners of Montana. Appalled, he returned east and wrote, "The buffalo has not simply diminished, it has been annihilated. Unless immediate measures are taken, the species will vanish before our very eyes." His words, once dismissed as alarmist, proved prophetic. President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who had once hunted buffalo himself in his youth, also came to see the slaughter as a national crime. Inspired by Hornaday's warnings, Roosevelt and others formed the American Bison Society in 1905. Their goal was simple but monumental, to pull the species back from the edge. Through private herds, national parks, and protected ranges, they sought to preserve what little remained. Yellowstone National Park, established in 1872, became the final refuge of a tiny herd, barely 24 animals at its lowest point. From them, today's bison descend. It was a narrow escape. Had just a few more years passed without intervention, the buffalo might have gone the way of the passenger pigeon, remembered only in stories and photographs. Instead, against all odds, they endured. By the 20th century, bison were slowly reintroduced to the plains, nurtured in sanctuaries, and eventually numbered in the hundreds of thousands once again. No longer endless, no longer wild in their millions, but alive. Yet the revival could not undo what was lost. For the Plains tribes, the near extermination of the buffalo had shattered their way of life. Reservation boundaries, hunger, and dependency had replaced the freedom of the hunt. Even as herds returned in small numbers, the spiritual bond could never be the same. The great communal hunts, the dances of Thanksgiving, the ceremonies that bound people to animal, all belonged to a world that had been silenced by rifles and greed. Still, the buffalo lived on in memory and symbol. For Native peoples, it remained a sacred presence, appearing in visions, stories, and songs. For Americans at large, it became a symbol of the West itself, a reminder of both the abundance once squandered and the possibility of redemption. Today, the bison stands as the national mammal of the United States, a living emblem of resilience. But symbols cannot mask the scars. The bones that once paved the plains, the hunger that stalked native camps, the greed that drove men to kill for sport and profit, all are part of the story as well. To walk in Yellowstone and see a herd grazing beneath the wide sky is to glimpse both survival and shadow, hope and loss. The animals endure, but they carry with them the weight of history. The last days of the great herds were more than a tragedy of nature. They were a turning point in the story of America. The West was no longer a land of thunder and abundance, but a frontier of fences, cattle, and commerce. The buffalo hunters etched their names into the annals of the Wild West. But what they left behind was not legend. It was absence. And yet the bison still breathe. Against all odds, they stand on the plains once more. No longer in millions, but enough to remind us of what once was. To look into their dark, ancient eyes is to see a reflection of endurance, of a spirit that refused to vanish, even when the world conspired against it. The question remains, what does their story teach us? That progress demands sacrifice? That greed blinds men to the consequences of their own hands? Or that no matter how close to destruction, life has a way of enduring, stubborn and unbroken? The thunder of the herds may be gone, but their echoes linger. And if you listen closely as the wind sweeps across the prairie grass, you might still hear it, the ghostly drum of hooves rolling across time, reminding us of an empire lost and a lesson we dare not forget.